I'm ready.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome Professor Ben for his seminar today at Cairo University, Faculty of Commerce. Let me introduce Professor Ben. Professor Ben is a full-time faculty member at the Georgia State University since 1994. He is also the Chief Executive Officer of American Capital Corporation, which provides financial auditing and tax planning service to corporations, partnerships, and highly represented individuals. He contracts with the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants to write questions for the CPA exam and conducts workshops on CPA exam writers. He is also a member of the board of the author of Federal Taxation, Comprehensive and Topics, and Federal Taxation Basic Principles, both published by CCH Incorporation. Furthermore, he is the co-author of a book on capital gain transactions and written papers featured in the Journal of Accountancy, CPA Journal, and other publications. At the Georgia State University, he is currently teaching graduate levels for financial accounting, management accounting, auditing, as well as other courses for senior comprehensive tax planning. So now I'm going to leave time for Ben to present today's valuable seminar.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Delighted to be here. As Dr. Ismail mentioned, I do some consulting. I do some, as a matter of fact, I provide financial planning services to corporations and partnerships and highly compensated individuals. I'd actually do three things. One is consulting. One is writing. I'm kind of a nut about writing. I co-author 3 textbooks that are used by United States universities. But I'm also kind of a nut about writing other things. For example, let me tell you a quick story. When I was young, I found that when I was dating, I scored more points by bringing a rose from my own garden than from the grocery store. So I had 5 roses. And I met Cece, who's now my wife, way in the back. It's not President Cece, although sometimes in our household, I think of her now as President Cece. But in any event, when we got married, I had 15 rose bushes. Her uncles were competitive rose growers. They would enter into shows and win ribbons. And they goaded me, they talked me into competing. And when I won a blue ribbon, I got hooked. So my rose garden went from 15 to 35, eventually to 150 rose bushes. And I won I was competing with Uncle Baxter and Uncle Carol, and it was a lot of fun. The Rose Society asked me to be the chairman of a fundraising committee to generate funds for a big national show. They needed $106,000. So I invited the committee members over to my house, and we sat around the dining room. The average age was about 75, and I was in my 30s. So the ideas going around the table were kind of, I didn't think we were going to generate much money. So I said, well, how about we write a book? And they looked at me kind of disbelievingly. And the meeting was in October, and then by the end of February, I had written the book, Everything Roses. And this ended up going to Home Depot, which today is the world's largest home improvement company. They have sales of $100 billion now, and bookstores. And so it generated more money, I guess, than they had generated from other projects. By the way, back at the time, I had to hand deliver every book to all the Home Depots in Atlanta, Georgia, and all the nurseries. So there were about 70 locations, and every location took 25 books. And after 1 month, they were sold out. And they took reorders from me. And I thought to myself, there's no way I can drive to all these stores and keep on, I had to go through the receiving dock, I had to process the books, and I had to put them on the shelves. One person couldn't do that. So I gave up doing that. I ended up taking my book in a national magazine. So I advertised in the National Rose magazine. And then I started getting orders from all over the country, from Maine to Texas so anyway, it was pretty successful. But then Cece and I started having children. We have 2 sons now. And the time that children take caused me to walk away from the Rose Garden. We ended up moving to a lake with no roses. I don't have any roses. And I felt that a lake would be a nice way to raise sons. Well, my oldest son loves to fish, and I never fished. My father didn't have time to teach me how to fish. So I wanted to teach my son how to fish. So I hired some experts to take me on the lake and show me the right way to do it. I would do research. And so when my son was 14, I gave him this gift called Everything Fishing. I wrote a book on fishing for him. And he now is 23, and he's using it when he fishes even today. So in any event, those are 2 things I do. I consult, I write, and the third thing I do is, I teach. I've been a full-time faculty member at Georgia State since 1994, and I thoroughly enjoy teaching. I also have some personal interests. One happens to be playing the piano, but I'm going to save that one for later. We'll talk about playing the piano. But right now, I'd like to share a story with you about my friends Greg and Harvey. Okay, Greg and Harvey. Let me see if I can walk around. I'll get a little closer here. Greg and Harvey. Well, I had been teaching this accounting course for a number of years, and we ended up hiring a new faculty member, Greg. And Greg didn't have any experience in teaching, and his business experience was also limited, and he was struggling teaching this course. His course evaluations were kind of bad. But all of a sudden, I noticed a big increase in his course evaluations. And I said, hey, Greg, this is terrific. What are you doing differently? Well, he was kind of a humble guy, He hemmed and hawed. He said, well, I hired a consultant. Well, I said, well, tell me more. He said, yeah, his name is Harvey. He's a master educator. He goes around the country educating educators, showing them how to teach more effectively. I thought, I wonder what Harvey would say about my course, which, at the time I thought was a cat's meow of courses. I thought to myself that, boy, if Harvey saw my course, he would say, wow, I've never seen a course this good. But there's the old saying, curiosity kills the cat. Well, this cat got killed. I hired Harvey and asked Harvey to consult with me. The contract stipulated that we would have 5 meetings in my office and 3 meetings in the classroom. And the course happened to be tax accounting, okay? And that's okay if you don't have any, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. He said, Chris, I don't understand tax accounting. And so would you do me a favor in our first meeting, show me on one piece of paper how the United States tax system works. One piece of paper. And I thought to myself, I already have it. This is going to be a breeze. So we met in my office, and here's what I showed Harvey. The tax model, U.S. taxation. And I walked through this with him. I won't bore you with the details, but I said to Harvey, we start up here with income from whatever source derived. I mean, if you earn income in Egypt, you still have to pay U.S. taxes on it. That's the way the U.S. tax system is. Wherever you earn income is taxable unless it's specifically excluded, like gifts. You know, gifts are tax-free. Or deferred, you know, like if you contribute to a retirement account, you don't have to pay taxes on that income. The result is a term called gross income. You subtract a bunch of deductions. It's kind of crazy. Deductions here, deductions there, and the result is taxable income. You apply the tax rates to the taxable income, and the result is a term called gross regular tax liability. You subtract some other stuff. Don't worry about it. It's called credits and prepayments. And the result is net regular tax liability. And finally, I said to Harvey, then you throw in a couple of special taxes, and the result is either what you owe the government or what they owe you. And that's the tax model. He said, great, Chris. I think I understand sort of what you said. But then he said to me, now, Chris, what I'd like you to do is walk me through day by day how you teach that course. I said, sure, Harvey. I said, we don't cover chapters 1 and 2 because that's kind of, I don't know, superfluous information. The audit probabilities, the history of U.S. tax system, I don't cover that. I want to get right into the heavy stuff, how you determine tax liability. So I said, Harvey, we start in chapter 3. We don't do chapters 1 and 2. We start right here, chapter 3. We talk about itemized deductions. From there, we go to the tax rates. We talk about the tax rates. We talk about special rules for wealthy people. From chapter 3, we go up here to chapter 4. We talk about special items of gross income, you know, things that are generally taxable. From there, we go to chapter 5. We talk about exclusions, income that's tax-free. From there, I said we go to chapter 6. We talk about deductions in general. And then chapter 7, we go to special deductions, mainly about real estate. And then from there, we go to chapter 8. We talk about what's known as itemized deductions, a special group of deductions. From there, we go to chapter 9. We talk about credits and prepayments. And from there, we go up to chapter 10, and we talk about property transactions. And chapter 10, 11, and 12. And from there, we go to, well, at that point, Harvey interrupted me. He said, Chris, hold on a second. I don't get it. You just showed me a logical sequence of steps for the U.S. tax model. It went from the top down to the bottom. And then you showed me how you teach the class to your students. And you're showing me that you're hop, skip, jumping all over the tax model. He said, why do you do that? And that kind of threw me for a loop. I had to think about it. And then I had a good comeback. I thought I did. I said, well, Harvey, if I didn't do that, then I'd be hop, skip, jumping all over the textbook. How do you think my students would feel about that? And Harvey said, not a problem. You see, these are first-time tax students. They don't understand the tax system. He said to me, when you start in the middle of the tax model and you're jumping all over the place, they just don't know where they should be. He said it would be far better to follow the logical sequencing of a course rather than follow the logical sequencing of the chapters of a textbook. And in order to do so, so long as you tell the students exactly where you want to be on a given day, it would be far more effective. So he told me what he wanted me to do for our next meeting was to realign all my topics so that they follow the tax model. So that was our second meeting. So this is what I provided to our second meeting. This is only one of 13 pages. So this column right here shows the topics. And he took a look at it. These are the topics. These are where it's covered in the material. And he was satisfied. He was okay with that. So we finished meeting number 2. Then he said to me, Chris, here's what I want you to do for our third meeting. Can you bring a sample of one of your exam questions, you know, and just show it to me? And I said, sure, you know. So I pulled one out. It happened to be this question. this question was on a tax transaction. And he took a look at it and he said, great. So now, Chris, can you show me how the students know what's expected of them? And I thought to myself, this is my moment to shine. You see, I prepare lecture notes for my students. They have about 400 pages of lecture notes, of templates showing you how to get the answer quickly. For example, for this type of transaction, here's my template. And so I said to Harvey, there it is, Harvey, right there. And he took a look at this. He went back to the question. And eventually his glasses went down and he was looking very closely. And I thought to myself, that's not a good sign. He said, Chris, I don't think you get it, Chris. You can't say, there it is, and expect the students to know what's expected of them. You have to literally tell them, almost like hold them by the hand and be very clear and tell them what's expected of them. So he said, Chris, what I want you to do for our fourth meeting is prepare learning objectives for every topic that you teach. I said, what? I mean, I got about 180 topics in this course, Harvey. You mean I have to have a learning objective for each one? He said, yeah. So I knew that this was not going to be a piece of cake, dealing with Harvey. So for our next meeting, meeting number 4, I provided Harvey with this third column, okay? These are my learning objectives for every topic covered, and there's 13 pages of this for 180 topics. Now, I thought I was a pretty good writer. I write technical stuff, I write fun stuff. I've been writing since I was in college. I had a paper published in the Journal of Accountancy when I was in college. So I thought I was a pretty good writer until I met Harvey. And when Harvey took a look at my learning objectives, I had everyone beginning with a verb, which you're supposed to do, but he didn't like my verbs. They were too ambiguous. So in other words, he didn't like saying stuff like understand the meaning of, or I don't know, things that are vague. He wanted me to be more specific with my verbs. So we had to devote another meeting to revising my verbs. So when I came back on the 5th meeting, he took a look at my verbs. He was finally satisfied, and that was it for our office meetings. Now, he owed me 3 classroom visits. So I was teaching 3 classes back to back to back in the same classroom. It was an older classroom. They had old facilities. In other words, we used I don't know if you remember those transparencies, those old transparencies, and then when you run your lecture notes through the copier, it heats up and it jams. And so I had 3 classes back to back to back. And I would use the same set of transparencies for all 3 classes because it was just so difficult to make sets of transparencies. And I finished my lecture for the first class, right? And I had marked up the transparencies. I didn't have enough time for my second class to erase them, so I'd bring the same transparencies and lecture and write notes over notes. And then by the time I got to the third class, I'd use the same transparencies. And to my misfortune, this was a class that Harvey decided to attend, right? So he sat quietly through my lecture, and when it was all done, the students left the classroom, and Harvey decided to stay and give me an immediate feedback. And what he said first was, Chris, those lecture notes of yours, not a good idea. The students deserve a fresh set of lecture notes. So you need to bring a fresh set of transparencies. They need to understand your lecture better. I said, okay, so I made that commitment. I was going to bring a fresh set of transparencies. Nowadays, we don't have to worry about that. We can use this type of technology and Xerox what we need, and it's very easy. But for a while, I was following that advice. He said another thing, Chris. is you have a tendency to ask your students a question at large, and if you don't get an immediate response, you tend to answer your own questions. He said, not a good idea. He said, when you ask the students a question and they don't give you an immediate response, just be patient. Look at your watch. When that second hand goes around by 30 seconds, they're going to feel so awkward and uncomfortable, they're going to start blurting out answers. And he was pretty much right. That's what I do now. I tell my students this story, by the way. And if I don't get an immediate response, I look at my watch. Eventually, they start responding. Another thing he said that I wasn't doing too well was keeping the class late. You know, students don't like to be kept past the appointed time. So now I keep a computer on my desk with a big time, you know, that shows the time. And so I'm always able to finish class right on time. So that's good too. He said, other than that, not bad. He said, sometimes you get out of your chair, you walk around, that's good. You project your voice, you know, so that's good too. So when it was all said and done, he only came to that one class. He owed me 3. I guess he still owes me 2 more visits, but I don't think I'll be seeing Harvey again. So in any event, what I thought was the Cat's Meow courses was a course that was in dire need of overhaul. And I've done what Harvey suggested. I've major overhaul to this course. And now I'm not going to go out on a limb and say it's the Cat's Meow courses, but I think it's a pretty good course now. It's a lot better than it was before. Now, I also teach auditing, graduate auditing, financial accounting, and managerial accounting. And I have applied Harvey's techniques to all of these courses. And what I've learned was that whatever course you teach, find a logical sequencing of the topics. Let me give you an example. Auditing. The phases of an audit kind of follow a logical sequencing. You know, you have to decide whether you want to audit the client. If you find that they don't have integrity, you probably want to stay away. So you do your preliminary work. If you decide to accept the engagement, then it goes on. You're going to gain understanding and knowledge of the client, its environment, its internal control. You're going to assess its risk of material misstatement. I don't want to get technical with you here, but then you prepare your audit plans. You do your internal control testing. You do your examination, your detailed testing of the records. You gather your evidence and you step back and say, hey, did the risk of material misstatement come out the way we thought it would be? If not, maybe we have to do more work. Ultimately, you write your report. So oftentimes students, even at Georgia State University, they'll take an auditing course and they jump all over this logical sequencing. And I noticed that the auditing course here does a lot of good things. For example, I went through the syllabus and I like the fact that you skip the chapter on legal liability. I do the same, right? Because students don't need to be taught how to be partners. We need to teach them how to be beginning associates. So, you know, there's 26 chapters in this book. And there's about 26 chapters in the book that I teach with, and we can't possibly cover all the chapters. So you have to pick and choose, right? Legal liability is not covered here, and I agree with that. Also, you can't cover all of the auditing cycles. In this textbook, it goes from chapter 14 to 23, 9 chapters on auditing cycles. Well, there's only 2 really big cycles, revenue and expenditure. So that's what I cover in my auditing course. You have to eliminate, choose what you're not going to cover. So in any event, we have 1 course, you have 2 courses. So your first course, the students are able to get a nice grounding in auditing. But I just noticed that with these phases of the audit, the students are going to start with chapter 8 in auditing 2, which is good. And they're going to stay on chapter 8 for the second phase and the third phase and so on. So it's going to go 8, 9, 10, and that's a nice sequence. Then it's going to skip over to chapter 13. It's going to come back to 11 and 12. Then they'll get into chapter 14. They'll get into the cycles. By the way, in auditing 1, they cover the very last phase here, the reporting. So it might be a good idea to wait until auditing 2 to cover that chapter on reporting, because with reporting, you have to decide how to prepare your audit opinion. Is it going to be a clean opinion? Is it going to be a modified? Is it going to be adverse, disclaimer? And of course, if it's going to be a qualified opinion, you have to figure out why it's going to be qualified. Did they not allow us to inspect inventory? Did they not give us a legal representation letter? I mean, it's either going to be a gap problem, generally accepted accounting principles, which means it's going to be either a qualified or adverse opinion, it's a problem, or it could be a GAS problem, G-A-A-S, which is a standards problem, scope limitation, lack of independence, something that would cause us to give a bad opinion. We would call it either qualified or disclaimer. But what leads to your selection of the opinion goes, that would be chapters 4 through, 24 in the textbook. So for them to understand the reporting process, my suggestion, at least if I were to ask Harvey, I'm sure Harvey would say this. Harvey would say, follow the logical sequencing when you teach the course. Don't follow the chapters. And just tell the students where you're going to be on a given day. So that was my look at the auditing course. This is our intermediate courses. You guys have similar intermediate courses than we do, and these are the ones we all follow the same thing. The logical sequencing for teaching intermediate: start with the assets, work down the line, assets, and go to the liabilities, and then go to your equity. And that's what's done here. I noticed that. I reviewed the syllabus, and indeed, this syllabus is all about equity and revenue recognition, earnings per share. There's some special topics that you have to cover, probably best to wait till intermediate 3. So everything seems to be just like the course I teach, and that's good. So in any event, some additional things I thought I would share with you on being effective in teaching. One is to throw a little humor in there now and then. Don't overdo it, but it's always good to have a little humor for your students, right? It kind of gets them in the mood. Another thing, I give my students this at the end of the final exam. As a matter of fact, you may not be able to see it too well. So I brought each of you one. You take one and pass it around. These are my buttons. The students love it. It says, I survived Professor Finn's accounting courses, or I survived Professor Finn's tax courses, right? And it doesn't cost that much money. I can get 500 buttons for under $100. And it goes a long way. I can use it for many, many semesters. And the students remember you for that. So that's another thing that seems to be effective with my students, even beyond, because don't forget, the successful students are going to be the ones that's going to be contributing to your program, right? So you want them to have a good feeling when they walk out of that final exam. Another thing I do, now I don't know if your system has this, but I get pictures of my students before the semester begins, and I print out the pictures, and if it's not a really big class, I'll memorize the faces. So when I walk into the class, I've memorized the faces. So this is what I get, and I'll take the face, I'll take the name, and I'll call roll on the first day without looking down. I'll see you, and I'll know your name, blah, blah, blah. It takes a little effort, but it's fun. I do it mainly because it's fun. And the students are amazed, so you know them by name when they've never met you before. So again, if you don't have the faces of your students, you can't do this, but if you do, it's not a bad idea. Here's something else that I do, seating charts. Now, as faculty, we know that students always sit in the same seats, right? Whatever seat they sit on the first day, they're usually going to be sitting there for the rest of the course. Still, if I'm at home and I'm corresponding with a student, it helps me to know, oh, that's the student that's sitting there, right? It helps me associate with the student. It enables me to communicate with the students more effectively. For example, if I'm talking to a student after class, I don't go into my grade book and see how they're doing. I write it down on my seating chart. So you can see I've given 2 exams here. Let's see, I've got a student here who had an 80 on the first exam and a 68 on the second exam. And that student wanted to talk to me after class. So I could glance at my seating chart and know what the problem was before the student came to me. I also use a seating chart for taking notes. For example, the students in yellow are the ones that wanted to meet with me to review their exams. So I knew after class, these are the students I would be meeting with, so I highlighted them in yellow. So I take a lot of notes on my seating chart. It makes me seem smart to them, right? Because I have things that I can get to really quickly. The grades, for example. Yeah, every time I post grades, I manually write them down on my seating chart. So that's been very effective. Now here's another one. On the first day of class, my students are invited to write their cell numbers down by their name. They don't have to, they don't want to, that's fine. But there's a couple of reasons why I do this. I played football a long time ago, and my coach always said, if you're not 5 minutes early, then you're 10 minutes late. And what my coach meant was, you can't get to practice right when it starts. You have to warm up, you got to get your equipment on, you got to get there early. So if you're not at least 5 minutes or 5 minutes early, then you're going to be 10 minutes late. Well, sometimes I'm late for class. And if I just show up and the students just sit and wait, maybe even leave, don't even wait for me, that's not good. If I try to communicate to my students through the university system, they might get the message 2 hours after the class is ended, right? So instead, when I'm driving in traffic and I know I'm going to be, say, 10 minutes late for class, I'll call up a student. And it usually takes maybe 4 or 5 students before somebody answers the phone. But when they finally do, I'll say, hey, would you mind letting the class know that we're going to start class 15 minutes late, okay? And they pass the word around, and then I show up 10 minutes late. And as a result, with due respect to my football coach, I have found a way to be 10 minutes late, but really 5 minutes early. Because their perception is that I'm 5 minutes early now, even though I'm 10 minutes late. So that one works pretty good. Nevertheless, I do try to arrive early. I usually arrive early for my class. I'm kind of a nut about that. I anticipate that the classroom could be locked. Maybe I don't have my key. Maybe the equipment is malfunctioning and I have to call tech support to get things running before class starts. Students may have administrative questions to get out of the way before I start my lecture, because my lectures usually go from the beginning to the end. So that's a good thing to do. Here's something else I do. I prepare an attendance roll. Now, some of my classes have a grade on participation and some of them don't. But when you have a class of 40 or 50, it's really difficult to grade them on participation. And you have some students that, they're with you, they understand what you're saying, but they're shy. You know, they don't like to speak in front of people. So for those classes that have a participation grade, I'll rely a lot on this. You know, I'll notice that out of 20 classes, this student attended 20 of them. Or this one's 20 out of 20. This one was only 9 out of 20, you know? And so that will affect their participation grade and also my judgment, you know, the subjective part of it. Those classes I teach that do not have a participation grade, I still do the attendance roll. And those students, psychologically, they show up. I get a high attendance for my students because they want to be on that roll. And if they come in late even, they'll make sure that they see me after class and put their name on the attendance roll. So I find that the attendance roll is a good thing to have no matter what. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about somebody you may or may not have heard about, Benjamin Bloom. But Benjamin Bloom, he wrote this paper back in the 1950s. It was called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. We call it Bloom's taxonomy. A taxonomy is a sequence of anything. And his paper was about cognitive learning. And what he said is to reach the highest level of learning, you've got to start at the lowest rung of the ladder. He said, you got to start by remembering, you know, memorize it. And then after that, once you can memorize it, then you have to paraphrase it, showing that you understand it. And once you understand it, then you can apply it. And after you apply it, now you're able to take different scenarios and analyze it. And after you analyze it, evaluate it. Maybe you want to take different points of view and combine them into a single nugget of truth. That's kind of what evaluating is. And finally, creating. Maybe the law is too ambiguous, the accounting principle, the auditing standard, the tax law. And that's where you take it to a really high level and, you know, you work with the Ministry of Finance. You want to rewrite the laws. So in any event, this is Bloom's taxonomy. Now, according to Bloom, again, each level has to be met before you can go up to the next level. All right? And Bloom said, and this, I'm going to read this. He said, educators tend to ask questions confined to the first two levels, 80 to 90% of the time. Okay? They don't get past the second level, 80 to 90% of the time. Now, I try to get past those two levels quickly. Okay? And my senior level accounting courses and my graduate level of courses, I try to get past these two levels into the next two. Apply and analyze. For some of my graduate courses, we'll even go higher. We'll go through evaluate and create. But senior level, you're doing well if you can get students to think at these levels, cognitive levels of thinking, of the apply and analyze. So let me just show you an example. It happens to be my tax course. Sorry, we don't have any tax professors here, but that's okay. I think you can still make sense out of it. Because what we have here is Bloom's taxonomy. It starts with remembering and understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. So here's an example with my students. There's a tax law in America that says gifts are tax-free. Okay, I memorized that. Gifts are tax-free. What does that mean? Well, what that means is, paraphrasing it, if you have what's known as an accession to wealth clearly realized, then it's then it's income. But if it's specifically written by Congress, it's tax-free. Well, once again, how do you apply that? And then I tell them some stories. You know, I tell them about this kid named Tom, 16. He smokes. He plays video games. His grandma's concerned about his welfare. She says, if you quit doing all that stuff, I'll give you $10,000 when you're 21. He does, she does. Is it taxable? And the answer is, it is taxable. And my students think, well, how is the IRS going to know about it? I said, that's not my job. My job is not to how to get away with stuff, it's to convey the technical merit of the tax law. So I say to them, it's taxable because he did and she did. There was a string attached. I won't get into a long lecture on this, but I explained to them how to apply the tax law. And then I take them to a higher level. I say, you know, what if grandma died and grandpa gave Tommy the $10,000? What then? And I go through all sorts of scenarios. And that's as high as I get in this course. I can't get into evaluating or creating with them. If they come into my Masters of Taxation program, then I can get higher. You know, here we might take several Supreme Court cases and blend them into a single tax law based on our interpretation. Or we may go to the very top and we may assume that we're the Undersecretary of the Treasury of the United States and we want to get a bill before Congress that's going to change the tax law. So that's what we would do there. Can't do that with senior level. But we're doing very well to get up to these two levels. Now, how do I get them that high? That's the big trick, okay? Well, here's how I try to bypass these first two levels. I allow my students to bring in 3 index cards on their exam. And the parameters are clearly specified in the syllabus. I explain it on the first day of class. I explain it before the exam. 3 cards, no bigger than 4 inches by 6 inches. One side only, no flaps. It's okay to manually write it. You can actually computer generate it, but if you're going to have different things pieced together like a quilt, tape it down. When I administer the exam, I will look at I'll hand deliver each exam, and I'll inspect the cards front and back. Sounds like it would take a long time, but it really doesn't. It's less than 5 minutes. So everybody, I've checked out their cards, and as a result, all that stuff you have to memorize, it's got a short shelf life anyway. They're going to forget that in 2 hours. Put it on the card. As a result, my exams are tougher. I can bring up to a higher level. My exams focus on like client advisory services rather than regurgitating stuff, right? Well, students do not always follow the rules, right? As you can imagine. So on the first day of class, I show my students my no-no bag. This is my no-no bag, okay? This is my bag that contains cards that exceeded the parameters. Now, I don't know if you in the back can see that. If I put this on the table, it's going to be all over the place, but probably, yeah, I'll do it anyway. Here's my no-no bag. So you see this card, too big. I had one student who heard my lecture, read the syllabus. She had the 4x6 cards, but she had 50 of them, okay? I have students that bring in flap after flap after flap, so they have all the lectures on these 3 index cards, right? I had a student who was sitting in the back, and his head was bobbing up and down during the exam, and I thought, this is kind of weird. So I went back to see what was going on. Well, he had reduced the size of his print so tiny that it could not be read by the naked eye. So he had a magnifying glass. And I didn't mind, but he didn't do too well on the exam, because if you ever look through a powerful telescope and you nudge it just a little bit, you're going like billions of miles across the sky. And that was his problem. He would try to focus on something and he couldn't stay on it, and he ran out of time. This wasn't his, by the way. This was another student. On her last day of class, she handed it to me out the door, said, I won't be needing this anymore. You can have this as a souvenir. So in any event, those index cards do have to be enforced. You do have to inspect them when you give out the exam. But in doing so, I think it's going to enable the students to tackle higher level questions. Now, this is kind of like, the saying, proof lies in the pudding. my students have competed against 105 other universities in a comprehensive consulting competition. For a while, it was sponsored by Arthur Anderson and Company, and then Deloitte sponsored it. They'd go into a small room, 4 students, and for 7 hours, they had to tackle all these comprehensive questions dealing with corporations, retirement planning, property transactions, and they had to put together a complete report in 7 hours. It was one of the most technical competitions in business in the United States. And well, after 10 years, we competed after 10 years, and my no-no bag. Yeah. So this is kind of tiny here, but these are all the universities out of 105 that ever won an award in this competition. And after 10 years, Georgia State was on top. You know, we were actually tied with Brigham Young University out in Utah for having won the most awards. So, you know, if proof lies in the pudding, there's your pudding right there. It does work. By the way, 85% of our competition had 2 tax courses. And at Georgia State, we only have 1 tax course. So my students were able to compete effectively. Well, I want to tell you about, this is kind of like the last segment. It's a big segment. It's something that I share with my students, and this is how to learn effectively. And I tie it in with the Suzuki method of music. But if I have time, I'm going to tell you another story. The story begins with my family. This is my family. And the ones I want to tell you about mainly is my sister Nora. We spell it N-O-R-A. I think you have Nora, right? And this is Nora. And this little guy here is Mike, my brother Mike. And this really little guy here is me, right? The rest of them, my brother Rich, my sister Molly, my sister Kathy, my mom, and my dad. And obviously this was a long time ago. And looking at my brother here, he doesn't look like he's that easy to get along with, and he really wasn't. We used to fight all the time. My sister Nora, she was a lot older than I. And when she was in high school, my father got transferred from one location to the next, which is really tough for a girl in high school. She has to break all of her connections, especially my sister Nora. She was dating this guy named Steve Gross. How do you forget that name, Steve Gross? And somewhere along the line, I'm only 6 at this time, Steve Gross gives me his Silvertone guitar. I mean, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why he did it. I guess I didn't understand the ways of love then, and probably don't understand them now. So in any event, I enjoyed learning how to play the guitar. By the time I was 13, my repertoire had expanded quite a bit. But in one of our many fights, my brother took the guitar and smashed it against the chair. No guitar. The replacement guitar he gave me was a cheapo, right? It was hard to play. My fingers were bleeding. I lost interest in the guitar. Then one day, I walked by the old family piano and I hit a few keys. And I thought, I wonder how it would be if I transferred what I knew on the guitar to the piano. So I sat down and I took the chords on the left hand, the picking on the right, and I found that the piano was easier to play than the guitar, at least for me. So my interest grew. My mother could read music, I couldn't. So I'd ask her to sit down at the piano and play simple pieces like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, you know, pieces by, you know, things that, believe it or not, I was interested in back then. And she would play it over and over and over and over, and I would sit there and I'd look and look and look and look, and I'd memorize it. And she'd go into the kitchen, continue cooking for the family, and I'd say, "Hey, Mom, I'm ready." She'd come back out, she'd play the next leg, you know, over and over and over. But after a while, the food would be burning, and I'd say, "One more time, Mom, one more time." But, you know, she got fed up with me and finally fired me as a student. So I had to figure a way. I was too much interested in learning how to play the piano. And so, by the way, before I go on, does anybody in here play an instrument? Anybody play anything? Piano, guitar? Anybody? Surely we have a musician in here. Well, even if we don't have a musician in here, everybody knows that there's only 7 notes, A through G, right? We don't have an H or an I or anything like that. And so, I came up with a way to replace my mother, on the piano at least. And the way I did was I got a friend named Don to take the notes and write the letters above them, A through G. I don't need anything else. You know, back in the olden days when music was invented, you know, centuries old, we didn't have audio and video equipment. But now, I don't need anybody to tell me what octave. I can listen to it. I don't need anybody to tell me what the fingering is, you know. I can figure that out. Whatever's convenient is the fingering you should use. So this is just an example. This is a Chopin piece. I was going to play it, but I don't have the, well, that's okay. That's okay. It's a beautiful piece, but if I played it, it would make you think of having to go to 3 faculty meetings in a day. It'd be very, you know, it'd be kind of slow. But in any event, you'll notice here that if it's an asterisk, like some of these have asterisks, well, that's just a black key. So all I needed was A through G, put an asterisk on it if it's a black key. And by the time I got to Notre Dame, one of my colleges, I was reading about this guy named Shinichi Suzuki, famous violin instructor back in the 1930s and 40s. Students were winning awards all over the globe. And he had a very unique way of teaching his students. And believe it or not, there is a connection between you guys teaching effectively and this story about me and my piano. Okay. Shinichi Suzuki, he would teach his students how to learn how to play the music before they would do an in-depth reading of the notes. And his rationale made sense to me. Don't we, when we're toddlers, don't we learn how to speak before we learn the rules of grammar, the alphabet? No, we're speaking first, and then we're learning all the rules later, right? So this is what he said. This was his. As a matter of fact, could I ask you to read that? Would you read that out loud for me, please?
Music reading should not be violent. Staying still and busy.
Thank you. Well read. And I realized while I was reading about Shinichi Suzuki that I was already following his plan without even knowing it. I was playing the music before learning how to read the notes, and even indeed today, I don't read music. So there is a connection to what I'm talking about, so let me continue here. I want to tell you about, and this is kind of embarrassing, but when I took my first accounting exam, I bombed it. And I mean, I asked the professor, my professor he was like Tariq Ismail. He was the chairman of the School of Accountancy. And I asked him for a meeting. And so we went into his office, and I said, Professor Powell, I really studied hard, and I bombed your exam. I was wondering if you could give me some guidance. Well, Professor Powell, he was kind of from the old school, and he had kind of a whiny voice. He said to me, oh, by the way, I showed him my evidence of studying. I showed him my Picasso. See, my book was filled with highlights. And I said, can you give me some guidance? I don't understand how I bombed it. Well, again, he was from the old school, whiny voice. He said, Mr. Fenn, you may be ignorant, but you're not stupid. If you were stupid, you would not have been admitted to the School of Accountancy in Notre Dame. So I'm 19 years old. I'm walking out of his office, scratching my head. What am I going to do? I mean, if I flunk out at Notre Dame, I'll be living with my parents again and probably digging holes for the city. Didn't want to do that. So I had to figure it out. I had to figure out the hard way. I reevaluated my approach. Here's my approach when I bombed that exam. I would go to the beginning, and I would read the notes thoroughly, word for word. I'd get past the first sentence, I was okay. Second sentence, okay. Third sentence, okay. But eventually I started blanking out. But I felt a sense of duty to continue reading every word. So I go all the way to the end and ask myself, what did I just read? I had no idea. So I go back to the beginning again and read it word for word. And I would repeat that, still blank out. So then I pull out my arsenal of highlighters. You know, I'd have green for the header, orange for the first sentence. I'd find a place for blue, you know. And before long, my notes looked like a Picasso, and I had this false sense of comfort. Hey, now I know it. And I went into the exam, and I got killed. So what I discovered the hard way, you know, they say necessity is the mother of invention, right? Well, it was a necessity that I invent a better way to study. And that's what I'm about to share with you. My new approach, it's kind of like the Suzuki method of music. I find it's more effective for a student to study starting at the back of the chapter than at the beginning of the chapter. What I want to share with you right now is what I share with my students, and I think it's not a bad idea for faculty to share this with their students on the first day of class. My graduate students come up to me after I give this little lecture on the Suzuki method of learning, and they say, gosh, I wish somebody had told me that my freshman year. My direction in education could have changed drastically. So this is what I want to share with you. It's a technique. And this one happens to be for my I provide them with a solution to the textbook. Some instructors don't like to do that. That's fine if you don't, but I do. Because I want my students to be able to figure out when they're on, you know, Saturday night, they're studying, and they don't understand how to go to the next step. They don't go to the refrigerator and pull out the food and watch a movie and wake up when they're too tired to study for their Sunday morning classes. So I have them provide them with the solutions. They can read the solution, they can break that mental obstacle and go right on to solving the problem. So anyway, this first step is simply download the solutions manual. The second step is to surf the chapter. Look at the budgeted time. Surfing the chapter, 4 minutes to surf a chapter. So I have them open up the chapter, look at the title, look at the headers, nothing else. Just look at the headers. You want to get some sense of what the chapter is about to set you up for success, for solving problems. Third step here is I have them read each assigned text problem and read the solution. You see, this is a far better approach to understanding what the chapter is about than reading those abstract objectives at the beginning of a chapter that we authors have to write. We do it for the publisher, but you know, I don't think it's that effective for the students. Way better to have them read the problems that are assigned and the solutions. Then I tell them to attempt to solve the problem open book. Use the open book, use the, you know, the lecture materials. But then, before the next week's classes begin, do it a second time using only your notes. Now, what they're doing is they're going to take their notes and they're going to realize that some stuff they wrote down they didn't need and some stuff they needed and didn't write down. And this is also part of the process of preparing those 3 index cards. You see, the 3 index cards not only bring them up to a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, but it also enables them to process the material better. You know, I got to tell you, I got 2 sons, and I try to help my son study. Like I had a son who was studying math, and he'd have his book in his bed. You know, he'd be in his bed like this, He'd open up his book, and in 5 minutes he was asleep. So I encourage my students to be proactive. You know, don't be sitting in bed, but sit at a desk and have your laptop open or a pencil and paper and get right into problem solving. And so 2 cycles. Before the next week's lectures begin, you should bring closures to the topic from last week. 2 cycles of problem solving. Before the exam, 1 more time. By this time, you've got your notes. All you're doing is reviewing, right? So there's no cramming before the exam. And the fact is, this is usually all my time my students have to do this. If you don't do an in-depth reading of the textbook, you're probably still going to be okay. Now, if you do have that time, go ahead and do an in-depth reading, I tell my students. Now, I don't know if you can read this from where you're sitting, but can you give this a shot right there?
And you can still read it without the note. This is fine. I will not read every letter myself, but the word.
You see, it's not necessary, not only each letter, but each word. You don't have to even read each word to understand it. That's what I had done when I was a student. It was a mistake. An in-depth reading of the textbook should, in my opinion, be the student's lowest priority. And I find that students sometimes do that and don't have time for problem solving. So this technique is useful not only for accounting courses, but biology, psychology, any course you take. With this approach, you want to start at the back of the chapter, not the front of the chapter. And the nice thing about textbooks is the problems and the questions at the back are not scrambled. They're in the sequence of the topics presented in the text, so it's easy to get to. So use the textbook really as research material. That pinpoints where you need to be. And then, as a last priority, if you have time, do an in-depth reading. So, by the way, in 2007, I entered a university-wide competition at Georgia State. We're not nearly as big as Cairo University. Now we're over 50,000, but at the time we were about 30,000. This competition was open to everybody, though. You know, not just finance, accounting, and marketing, but also psychology and social, arts and letters, science. And it was a competition on effective teaching. And I submitted an abstract, and they invited me to the final competition against a team of finance professors. I said, well, they wanted me to present before a faculty committee. I said, can you get me a piano? They did. So I opened up by playing a little Moonlight Sonata. And I showed them the segue from playing the music, on a piano to playing the music in a course. Because solving problems to me is like playing the music. And I showed them the importance of playing the music before the in-depth reading of the notes. And anyway, it went over pretty well. And I'm proud to say, when it was all said and done, I beat out the finance guys. So, hip hooray for that. Well, I need to bring this to a close, don't I? So, let me just say that we all know that this is not a static environment, okay? We need to adapt to change, whether it's updating class projects on data analytics, revising our critical writing projects, staying current with changes in accounting principles or auditing standards, tax laws, or maybe just changing the way we teach, right? Maybe adapting a few things to help us teach a little bit more effectively. So in addition to Harvey Brightman, Benjamin Bloom, Shinichi Suzuki, I'd like to pay homage to another great giant in teaching, okay? How fitting it is that Stephen Hawking, who passed away less than 2 months ago, passed away on Pi Day, right? March 14th. So, you know, I love what he said about, with that impish grin, about change. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to present his words in kind of a mysterious format. To me, it makes me think of those magnificent Egyptian hieroglyphs. So I decided to present it this way. And this is what Stephen Hawking said. Can I ask you for one last time, see if you can read this? Now, this is a big challenge here. This is, can you guys read this? Give it a shot. It's cryptic, isn't it?
Yes.
I'll start you off. Once you get it, you'll see it. You'll see it perfectly. Intelligence is right. And so that's it. I want to say thank you to Tariq Ismail, Ahmed, really all the faculty of commerce who've been so hospitable to myself and to Cece for inviting me into your classroom. And I guess finally, I just want to thank you guys for attending this lecture. I hope this helps you. Maybe you'll pick up a little bit of nugget to help you teach more effectively. But in doing so, I wish you well. Thank you.